Howdy, Space Rangers, Captain Phoenix here. And this is a very interesting video of mine that I'm making today. And the reason I say it's very interesting is because I both have a lot, too much, and too little to say. I didn't want to make this a full blown edited video like my normal video essays because I don't feel like it deserves that much attention. But at the same time, I also didn't want to make this like a short or like a community post because I do have a bunch of thoughts I want to get out there. And these thoughts are very like scattered and mostly random. I hope not to go on a tangent. I went on a tangent yesterday with my mall trailer reaction video. That was not the plan at all. So today I want to keep the discussion a bit more focused, but also as in not as in depth as I normally go into, because I do feel like the time for in-depth stuff will come, especially with more projects as the year goes by. But I did want to talk about this because I do think that this is a very important discussion I want to talk about, as it also kind of ties into that video I made for what Star Wars 2026 is looking like. A video where I actually did put a bit more effort into. So, you know, skipping all the formalities and all the technicalities and the rambling, let's just get to the meat of the discussion. And that was, as of recording last week, Kathleen Kennedy, the former president of Lucasfilm, keep in mind it's said former, had been announced that she is now actually leaving Lucasfilm. This is a very big announcement. For those who don't know, Kathleen Kennedy was the president of Lucasfilm for basically, is it 11 years now? No, 12 years now. She got brought there after Star Wars was bought by Disney from George Lucas in 2012. Kathleen Kennedy got made the president of Lucasfilm, and basically every Star Wars project we've had since then has been under her command. So this includes Rebels, which came out in 2014. That's why I say 12 years, because we haven't really seen Kennedy's work since Rebels. So even though Star Wars was bought in 2012, we haven't really seen anything since 2014. So that's why I say she's been running Star Wars for 12 years. So yes, technically it would be, 14 years, 14, 15 years, but technically it's been 12 years if I was just going by the product she's released. So everything from like Rebels and the sequel trilogy to the Mandoverse to Disney Plus, at least Star Wars Disney Plus, to Andor, it's all been because of Kathleen Kennedy. She's the person behind all this. And so her announcement that she was finally stepping down and retiring as president of Lucasfilm basically sent shockwaves through the community and through me especially, because, well, oh crap, that was not meant to happen. And through me as well, because, well, again, most of the Star Wars I know has been under Kathleen. And so with her leaving, we're essentially entering a new era of the franchise. And I just kind of wanted to talk about that a bit and just like what a post Kathleen world is going to look like, and whether or not it will be for the better, for the worse, or if things will stay the same. So so with that said, let's talk about a bit about who Kathleen Kennedy is. Kathleen Kennedy, for those who don't know, is actually a veteran when it comes to Hollywood. She's a bit of a Hollywood veteran. No, she's not like this acclaimed director or writer, but she is a producer. And with that said, she is arguably one of the most acclaimed and well decorated producers of all time. She's, again, as I mentioned, she is a Hollywood veteran, and she's very good and close friends with other creatives in the industry like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. She worked on movies like Indiana Jones, Jurassic Park, and E.T. These are some of the classics that she has worked on. And if you've seen these three examples I listed, you know there's a pattern here. Yeah, that's right. Not only has she worked with Lucasfilm for a long time, but as I mentioned before, she's also very good friends with Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, and again has worked on a good handful of their movies. So it makes a lot of sense that when the time came, George Lucas, one of her close friends, may repeat, oh Jesus, this video is just so bad. One of her close friends, as I mentioned again, would obviously give the reins to her. However, I think that this was definitely a strange decision in hindsight, because again, Kathleen isn't a creative. She's not a storyteller. She may fund stories, and may get you the resources to tell that story together, but she's not a storyteller. Me just looking up on her Wikipedia page, she doesn't have any writing or directing credits. As far as I can tell, she's never been behind the camera. She's just the one who gathers stuff for the actual people behind the camera to do their things, which, again, goes obviously to show her work as a producer. She's a good producer, but we don't know if she's a good storytelling head. With that said, though, I do understand where George Lucas was coming from in making her the president of his company. And that, of course, comes from a business decision. I know a lot of people like to hail George Lucas as this creative visionary, which he is. Let me not take that away from George Lucas. He has given us a lot of good stuff, and he has pushed the film industry far and wide. But another thing you need to remember about George is that he's also a businessman. The reason why he's so rich, even to this day, after selling Star Wars, is because he still has a lot of the merchandising rights to Star Wars. George Lucas knew how to milk the freak out of his product. And basically, when he sold the product to Kathleen, he kind of sold it to her with that same mindset that she would treat Star Wars as a business first and foremost, and again, make as much money as she can out of it. That includes spin offs, that includes toys, that includes video games, that includes every single thing you can do with Star Wars to merchandise it to hell and back. And honestly, it worked. Again, regardless of what you think of the quality of Star Wars has ultimately been profitable for Disney because of Kathleen's merchandising of the company, because of all the products and tie-ins she has given to other companies, and basically allowing the brand to grow its roots and making it to as accessible to as many people as possible. Star Wars has been bringing in a profit, kind of supplementary in the background, away from the movies and all that. So from a business standpoint, yes, I get why George made Kathleen the president. She was a very close friend of his. She is a very close friend of his. As far as I'm aware, these two are still on good terms with each other. So she's a very close friend of his, and she's also a businesswoman. However, that's the problem with Kathleen. That's where her talents kind of stop. She is a businesswoman at heart, and a businesswoman is what she thrives at being. However, she doesn't thrive at storytelling, and that's, I think, a big problem here. Again, I'm not really trying to glaze George Lucas. I didn't grow up in the George Lucas era, so I don't have as much nostalgia to him. In fact, if anything, I actually grew up in that Kathleen Kennedy era. For those who don't know, The Force Awakens was my first ever Star Wars movie. That was the first Star Wars movie I'd ever seen, and that's what brought me into the franchise and what obviously got me just addicted to everything Star Wars. It all began with The Force Awakens. So I kind of have to attribute me being a fan to Kathleen Kennedy. So this isn't a hate video. If you're coming here expecting me to hate on Kathleen, it's not. It's really just more of me kind of giving a study, or at least a look into how she ran the company, both the goods and the bad. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. And with that said, I'm also not trying to glaze George Lucas, but I do think that George and Kathleen are very different people on a fundamental level. George, as I mentioned, is both a visionary when it comes to filmmaking, and he's also someone who's smart when it comes to business. I've talked about how well George is when it comes to doing business, about how he was able to merchandise and market Star Wars so well that he's earning money literally in his sleep. And that's the other thing as well. George is a visionary. George is a storyteller. And it's from George that we got Star Wars. We obviously got the original trilogy, and then he waited until technology improved enough for him to get for him to make the prequel trilogy. George always had a plan when it came to Star Wars. He always had a plan, and he always had an intention with the products he made. Because remember, under George Lucas, the only screen products we got for Star Wars was the original trilogy, the prequels, and the Clone Wars movie and TV show. Yeah, we got some background stuff like the Caravan of, the Ewok movies and the holiday special, but mainly Star Wars was really just those things. Those were the mainstream Star Wars products and projects, and that's what George had. He always had that vision of just there being movies 1 to 6. Yes, there was other canon stuff. The EU and the Legends continuity existed in the background, but it wasn't really taken as serious canon. It had George's stamp of approval because, again, he just needed to get Star Wars out as far as he could, and books were also another way of doing that, but he never considered them his true canon. His true canon always began and ended with the 6 movies, of course, with the Clone Wars TV show thrown in there. First we had the Gendy show, and then he did the 2008 CG show, which he preferred more, and so on and so forth. So but my point is that George always had a plan when it came to Star Wars. He always had this one big story he wanted to tell, and he didn't want to stretch it out past what it was. Or at the very least, he didn't want to stretch it out past that with a plan, which is, of course, where, as I mentioned in my last video, he actually did have a script for the sequel trilogy. There was originally a trilogy that George Lucas was kind of conceptualizing, in which Darth Maul would be the main villain. We'd get to learn a bit more about the Force. It would kind of tie into the Clone Wars cartoon, all that stuff. But I think that was where George Lucas's strength was. He had strengths both as a storyteller and as a businessman, and that's how Star Wars was able to thrive on him. Kathleen, though, only saw Star Wars as a business, and that's why it kind of struggled on her belt, which is why I want to talk about Kathleen's short-sightedness. Now, despite heading Star Wars for the last 12 years, I think it's become very apparent that Kathleen Kennedy has a lot of short-sightedness and how should I say, instant gratification when it comes to Star Wars. She doesn't think of the long, she doesn't think of the long term. She doesn't play the long game. She basically looks for short profits, short and big profits as soon as possible. Is it big bursts? Yeah, short, big bursts of profit as soon as possible. Kathleen didn't go into Star Wars with a plan. And I think that this problem is very much a Kathleen thing and not a Disney thing. Because when you compare how Kathleen runs Star Wars compared to how Kevin runs Marvel, there's a very big difference. When it comes to running the MCU, Kevin Feige very much has a plan. He has a plan for how things should go. Yes, the plan can change, and he doesn't focus on every little detail, but he does have a roadmap for how things go. The Avengers, for example, in the old Marvel Phase 1 to 3, the Avengers were always supposed to fight Thanos. Yes, Kevin did not come up with a story. Kevin and other writers came up with a strong story for how Infinity War should look like, but the finish line was always going to have the Avengers fighting Thanos. Captain America 3 was never going to be Civil War. It was going to be Captain America versus the Serpent Society, but they did change it because they thought Civil War was a better story. However, a Captain America 3 was always planned. And if we look at new Marvel now, post Phase 3, we can see that there was a plan in the background, a way more structured plan with a lot more wires, with a lot more wires and wheels and cogs behind it. We had King. King was going to be the new big bad of the MCU, and if anything, King was actually built up a lot more than Thanos. King had a lot more screen time. He had a lot more development in the movies and shows he appeared in. We obviously got to see him a lot, especially in Ant-Man Quantumania and Loki, where he served as the main antagonists of both. And you could tell that Marvel was kind of learning their lesson from Thanos. Thanos, they just kind of teased him up until Infinity War. King, they wanted to properly develop him up until his movie. But then, of course, the Jonathan Majors drama happened, and instead of recasting for whatever dumb decision, Marvel went back on their plan and they used Doctor Doom as the big bad instead. This was clearly just a lack of planning on Kevin Feige's part, and it's something I do criticize Marvel about to this day, despite me not making a video on it. But it is very uncharacteristic for Kevin, and it's why a lot of people are very apprehensive to Robert Downey Jr. playing Doctor Doom in Doomsday, because it just doesn't feel planned. It feels injected in there. It feels abruptly dropped on us, which is not something the MCU is known for. Again, criticize the MCU for all you think the MCU needs to be criticized for, but one thing you cannot deny is that there is no plan. And that's what makes the MCU stand out from other cinematic universes, is that it's one big connected universe with a planned story from beginning to end. Again, all the little details may not be ironed out, but there is genuinely, or at least there is a general line of how the story should go in a 3-act structure, for lack of a better word. Star Wars doesn't have that. Star Wars, the way we've seen Star Wars operated for the last 12 years, seems to be, we're going to work on whatever project seems to work for us, and we're just kind of gonna make things up as we go along, right? We had The Force Awakens. The Force Awakens was meant to be a soft reboot for the franchise, a movie that takes us back to basics for Star Wars and introduces a whole new generation to this franchise. And I'd say on that front, it did well. However, rewatching The Force Awakens, I can't help but compare it to A New Hope. Everyone has, but you can't help but compare Force Awakens to the movie other movies that came before it, and how it just kind of copies those movies in an attempt to obviously copy their greatness, but to bring people into Star Wars. But it's very clear The Force Awakens was so focused on bringing people into Star Wars, they forgot to have a plan going forward. Granted, to J.J. Abrams' credit, he did at least plant some seeds or some questions for what the story should look like going forward. The other movies obviously failed to deliver, but there was at least some idea that they wanted to carry on a franchise. The problem is they had no plan, and this is very obvious. I think it has to be, and Disney, and I guess more specifically Lucasfilm, basically have declared, or basically have admitted that they didn't have a plan to begin with. There was no plan for Star Wars, for what the sequel trilogy would look like in the beginning. They just wanted to make a movie and get it out there to rake in the billions, and obviously to drum up interest in Star Wars once more. Because remember, the franchise had been dormant for 10 years at this point. So they wanted to get the general audiences hyped for Star Wars once again. And so they didn't really care about a plan, they just cared about getting a movie out there. Obviously, they'd come to regret this decision later, but as we see, this is one of Kennedy's first example of short-sightedness, where not having a plan came to bite her in the butt. The sequel trilogy failed because there was no plan. The Last Jedi went off and did its own thing, and then Rise of Skywalker came in and undid a lot of what Last Jedi did and tried to do its own thing, which led to the movie feeling very complicated. And as such, a lot of fans don't look on the sequel trilogy kindly, not just because of petty reasons, but also because they are just annoyed that there was no plan, there was no roadmap, there was no synopsis or bullet points of what could be done forward. This was also sullied by the fact that Kathleen Kennedy herself said that Star Wars, and this is me just kind of paraphrasing what she said in interviews, but Star Wars has no source material. In many interviews, she said that Star Wars had no source material, and they kind of had to make up the story for the sequel trilogy from scratch, and there was nothing to draw on. Obviously, this pissed off a lot of fans because that's not true. At the time, the EU and the Legends novels existed. The extended universe was like this huge playground for Star Wars that used the movies as a jumping off point to tell their own stories. And even though I'm not well versed in the EU, I do know that there were a lot of stories told that took place post Return of the Jedi. There were a lot of ideas Kathleen and crew could have grabbed and cooked up with to tell the movies. Hell, as far as I'm aware, apparently they did do that for Rise of Skywalker. Apparently there was a book in the extended universe called Dark Empire, which actually did have a planet where Palpatine's clone resided in, and he had like his own private army. So it's clear that the new Star Wars movies did take inspiration from the extended universe, but Kathleen didn't want to adapt those stories. I think it's entirely fair that Kathleen didn't want to adapt the stories, as the extended universe was so full of content at this point that trying to make any Star Wars movies around it would have been impossible. So I fully understand and kind of support her decanonizing Legends, but saying that there was no stories to take inspiration from or that there was no source material is definitely a wild take, especially when she herself greenlit projects that are based off the extended universe, including and up to even as recently as the Acolyte, which came out 2 years ago, where obviously we get to see Darth Plagueis, and that show kind of takes a lot of cues from the Darth Plagueis book. But that's neither here nor there. So Kathleen basically got around this whole, oh, did you even have a plan for Star Wars, by saying we had no source material. So we had to make everything up as we went along, which, as we know, is false. There was a lot of stories she could have had creatives borrow from in order to tell a proper story in universe. Anyway, as I mentioned, the sequel trilogy is the first evidence of Lucasfilm's short-sightedness when it comes to Star Wars. They were only looking for short-term gain. And of course, the second example of short-sightedness comes from the Disney Plus shows, specifically the Mandoverse. As we know, The Mandalorian was Disney Plus's biggest success basically ever. This was the most watched show on the platform, and it's basically what put Star Wars on the map again. If you were a Star Wars fan in 2020, you would know that there was actually a bit of hope for the franchise. Even though Rise of Skywalker was definitely disappointing to a lot of us still had hope for the franchise because some good projects were being made on TV. Specifically, again at this time, Clone Wars Season 7 and The Mandalorian were airing. And of course, everyone was just happy that we'll gain some good Star Wars content. However, the short-term goals were very apparent in the Mandoverse because big story decisions or big story plans that seemed to be cooking in the background were falling apart immediately. At the end of The Mandalorian Season 2, for example, Mando and Grogu split up. And instead of waiting years to get back together, they get back together in a spin-off show, that being the Book of Boba Fett. So you don't even get to see Mando go on any adventures on his own without Grogu. Why? Because Grogu is the company's cash cow. We can't have a story without Grogu in it because that means less money and merchandise to be made of the character. And of course, we also get stories like Ahsoka. As far as we are aware, Dave Filoni was planning on doing a Mandoverse movie, which brought every character from the Mandoverse together. But as it stands, that Mandoverse movie hasn't been built up to very well. And that's mainly because there is no build-up in these shows yet. Aside from establishing characters like Mando, Boba Fett, and Ahsoka, there doesn't seem to be a bigger plan going forward outside of Thrawn has made it back to the main galaxy. And we'll see what will happen with Thrawn in Ahsoka Season 2. But as it stands, there doesn't seem to be that many big plans for the Mandoverse movie, even including the new Mandalorian movie coming out next year, as there doesn't seem to be a big storyline being built up to, again, outside of Thrawn. And other threats have already been taken care of, like Moff Gideon. This kind of goes to show that Star Wars is very much aimless. They are kind of just doing whatever feels right in the moment instead of trying to establish a story and build off of it. You could argue that the Mandoverse was Kathleen attempting to do something akin to Marvel, where she creates this interconnected, storyline that grabs different characters that live in the same universe and putting them all together to go on one big adventure. But it's very clear that this is her first time doing so. Kathleen, just for lack of a better word or for lack of a better description, just doesn't know how to plan stories and have them build up properly like Kevin Feige does. Kathleen is no Kevin Feige. Kevin Feige is very clearly a Marvel fan who loves the characters from the books and wants them to share the same world but on the big screen. And obviously, we get to see this through his plans in the MCU. Again, say what you will about the multiverse saga so far, but you can't deny that it does feel like a comic book world with many characters living in it and, of course, crossing over with each other every now and again. Disney has tried to do the same thing again with the Mandoverse show specifically, but they've done such a piss poor job at proper planning and, of course, consequences that it feels very safe. Grogu is gone. Oh wait, no, Grogu is back. Moff Gideon is defeated. Oh no, we have to bring him back for one more threat. Now we can kill him off properly. Thrawn is in the main galaxy. Well, like you don't know how we're gonna do it because how we're gonna have this war because as far as we're concerned, the main galaxy was at peace for 30 years. It feels very convoluted. It feels very safe and convoluted for Star Wars to be doing its own thing, mainly because again they don't have a plan for it. They're just doing storylines that feel right in the moment rather than trying to come up with stories that have a long-term um payoff like Marvel does. I'm not saying Star Wars should be like Marvel. I'm not saying they should be pumping out a new show movie every month or something. But what I am saying is that there needs to be a more structured universe. And Kathleen has shown she can't do that. That is not in her wheelhouse. She's good at marketing styles. She's good at promoting at greenlighting and promoting new projects that experiment with the brand. But she is very much not good at telling a structured storyline the same way Kevin Feige did. And of course, this brings us to her departure at Lucasfilm, her big swan song. Now, if I'm not wrong, you guys can correct me on this one, but I'm pretty sure last year, when it was leaked that Kathleen Kennedy was leaving Lucasfilm again, let me take a guess. The amount of times that it's been said Kathleen Kennedy is retiring from Lucasfilm is ridiculous. This crap has been happening since The Last Jedi. I remember after The Last Jedi came out, all through 2018, people were like, oh, Kathleen Kennedy's gonna leave. Kathleen Kennedy's gonna leave. This movie was so embarrassing that she's gonna retire. And guess what? She didn't retire. And ever since then, every year, we've been getting like a fake announcement or leak that Kathleen Kennedy is retiring, and they've all been proven false. We got one last year as well after Star Wars Celebration where she said she was where people were theorizing she was going to retire and she didn't. No, it was before Star Wars Celebration where people were theorizing she was going to retire and she didn't. She confirmed that she wasn't, and of course a lot of people were annoyed. However, I do think I remember an article back then that where it came from Kathleen's own mouth that she said that she did want to go out on a banger. That if she was to retire, she wanted to go out on a big win, something that cemented her legacy in Star Wars forever. And I think that big win more or less came in the form of Andor. Andor is a critically acclaimed show that has been nominated for many awards, both season 1 and 2. And it's a show that's been praised high and low by Star Wars fans. For all intents and purposes, Andor is a big win. It is an objective win for the company. And even after the rise of Sky, and as we know, after the rise of Skywalker, Lucasfilm was terrified of releasing a new movie in cinemas, mainly because people just didn't like it. For those who don't know, there was actually a huge plan to release a Star Wars film basically every year in cinemas. Even after Rise of Skywalker, a new film was slated to come out in 2022. Again, as we know, those plans fell through after the huge, disappointment fans had with Star Wars, with the Rise of Skywalker. And so Disney has been terrified of releasing a new film in theaters. And as we know, Kathleen, this obviously didn't make Kathleen happy at all. Mainly because she didn't want her legacy to be relegated to just a streaming service. She wanted to obviously come back to theaters, which is why I can only assume she was pushing for the Mando and Grogu movie to be a theatrical release, to be the next big Star Wars film. So even though she's retired, we do know at the very least Mando and Grogu and Starfighter are gonna be her big legacies, the last movies she worked on before she left the company. And in terms of leaving a legacy behind, I guess this was good enough for her. Because again, Star Wars has been in a rut. I've talked about how the canon projects all have a bit of short sightedness to them, but it's also important to remember that a lot of projects have been put on the shelf or cancelled in the background. There was a show called Rogue Squadron, which was meant to take place in between episode 4 and 5, if I'm not wrong. That got cancelled. The Taika Waititi movie basically has been cancelled. The trilogy being made by the showrunners of Game of Thrones, that was cancelled, especially if the showrunners of Game of Thrones ruined season 8 of their show and people didn't want them to work on anything else. So Kathy Kennedy's had to cancel a lot of Star Wars projects in the background, mainly because either the company didn't have enough belief in them or they just couldn't get enough legs to get off the ground. For whatever reason, Kathleen has been suffering a lot of else in the background as well. And so I guess she reached a point in a time where, because mind that she's like 70, let's keep this in mind, this lady's like 70, but I think she's reached a point in time where she's realized that she can't She can't take any more else and she can't keep doing this forever. So she might as well go out on a semi decent win. So I think having a big win like Andor and finally getting two movies in theaters after half a decade of nothing was good enough for her to bow out to the company. Whether or not The Mandalorian and Grogu and Starfighter will be received well is to be seen, but I think Kathleen decided that this was a good place to bow out. Finally getting two Star Wars movies in theaters again, especially after the embarrassing reception to The Rise of Skywalker. And of course, after greenlighting and more or less producing Andor, a show she actually fought tooth and nail to get made, I figured that this I figured that she figured that this is the best time to stop. And of course, after retiring, it was announced who the new two producers of Lucasfilm would be. That being Dave Filoni and let me get her name right, Lin-Wen Brennan. These two are going to be the new co-CEOs or presidents of Lucasfilm. Dave Filoni is going to take control of the creative side, while Lin-Wen will take control over the financial side. And honestly, I think this is a lot better than the old system, to me personally. I think that this system that they are going for is way better than having Lucasfilm be run by one person. Marvel currently is still only run by one person, that being Kevin Feige. But I think studios have realized that in order to get a big IP right, they're gonna need more cooks in the kitchen. And so it's no longer under one person's vision. DC is being ran by two people who I'll touch on in a minute. While obviously back to Star Wars, we've gone from it being run by one person to two people. And I said, I think this is a right step to take. Kathleen Kennedy, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't know how to storytell. She knows how to produce and take care of finances, but she doesn't know how to tell a proper story. So I think having two people work on their own jobs is the right way to do it. Dave can take care of the storytelling of Star Wars, while Lin-Wen can take care of the financials of Star Wars, make sure everything flows well and goes great together. However, when it comes to Dave Filoni, not everything is sunshine and rainbows. I want to talk about Dave Filoni for a bit, but I won't go into as depth with him as I did about Kathleen Kennedy. So let me give you a rundown of who Dave Filoni is. Dave Filoni is basically Star Wars' number one fan. He obviously grew up with the original trilogy back in the day, and of course, when he found his opportunity to work on Star Wars, he took it. Dave Filoni is both a producer and a creative in when it comes to the industry. He's worked on other projects like Avatar The Last Airbender before, a show he's both written and produced on. And of course, after finishing Avatar, or at the very least doing his share working on Avatar, he went to go work for Star Wars. He was the director behind the Clone Wars movie, and he was basically the creator and showrunner of that show. Characters like Ahsoka, and not Asajj Ventress, who was it? Characters like Ahsoka and Cad Bane, and who else appeared in the Clone Wars? And Captain Rex. All of those guys were creations of his. And Dave Filoni has kind of been a Star Wars veteran, not as big as Kathleen, but definitely a big veteran because he's been heading and he's been spearheading the animation side of Star Wars since. After finishing Clone Wars, he's the guy who created and wrote most of Rebels. He was the showrunner of Rebels. And after Rebels, he worked a bit on Bad Batch, though that wasn't fully his project, and he even directed the first episode of Resistance, though I also don't think he worked on much of Resistance. He did come back to finish Clone Wars Season 7 in 2020, and then went ahead to help Jon Favreau work on the live-action Mandoverse stuff. I do want to say this louder for the people in the back because this is a huge misconception they keep forgetting, but I just want to repeat it for the sake of repeating it. Dave Filoni did not create the Mandoverse. Let's just get that out of the way. He did not create the Mandoverse. The Mandalorian was not made by Dave Filoni. That was made by Jon Favreau. The Book of Boba Fett was not made by Dave Filoni. That was made by Jon Favreau. Skeleton Crew, which also takes place in this timeline, was not made by Dave Filoni. That was made by John Watts. The only show in the Mandoverse that was made by Dave Filoni, top to bottom, like we cannot, disagree on this one, is Ahsoka. But I think it's important to remember that, yes, Dave Filoni did work on the Mandoverse. He was basically Jon Favreau's right-hand man. So, but I do want to get this clear. The projects were made and headed and showrun by Jon Favreau. He's the man who made The Mandalorian. He's the man who greenlit the Book of Boba Fett. And he's the man who helped Dave on Ahsoka. But mainly the first two shows, he's the man who created them and who headed them. And so, I just want to get that clear because as of recent, Dave Filoni has come under a lot of fire from Star Wars fans. Now, funny story is that back in the day, I want to say back in the day during like Clone Wars Season 7, so as late or as early as Clone Season 7, depending how you look at it, a lot of people were hoping Dave Filoni would take over Star Wars as the new president of Lucasfilm. Remember, Kathleen Kennedy was not looked on in a bright light, especially after The Last Jedi, and a lot of people were aching for her to retire and get replaced by a different person. A lot of people have been hoping that this person would be Dave Filoni. The Dave Filoni would come in into the the driver's seat and head Star Wars into a new direction. And another reason I forgot to mention that a lot of people love Dave Filoni for this is because Dave Filoni was also mentored by George Lucas. He was also a close friend of George Lucas, and a lot of times when he was working on scripts, he'd even take them to George to be proofread, not just in Clone Wars but also in Rebels. A lot of the scripts he had for Rebels, he would take them to George Lucas basically to get his stamp of approval. A lot of people like to compare George Lucas and Dave Filoni to kind of like Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan. It's definitely a master and relationship kind of relationship, which it is. Wait, master and apprentice kind of relationship. That's what I meant to say, yes. Which it very much is. Dave Filoni has worked and learned from both George Lucas and Kathleen Kennedy. And he honestly would not be here or doing all these things without Kathleen Kennedy. And I wouldn't be surprised if it came out that Kathleen Kennedy did handpick Dave Filoni to run Star Wars the same way George Lucas handpicked her to run Star Wars. But that's neither here nor there. Basically, as I mentioned, in the last couple of years, a lot of fans were really hoping Dave Filoni would come in and head Star Wars once and for all, and finally take the company out of Kennedy's cold, dark hands. But and a lot of people's hope. However, after Filoni made his breakthrough into the live action projects, a shift started to happen. A lot of people really started to dislike Filoni. And as I mentioned, this is after he broke into the live action field, mainly with the Book of Boba Fett. I remember back in 2021, a lot of people were blaming Dave Filoni for how bad the Book of Boba Fett was, when again, Dave didn't make this show. He didn't write this show. The only episode of The Mandalorian in Book of Boba Fett that Dave directed was the Ahsoka episode in season 2 of The Mandalorian. And I think he wrote a couple more episodes, but that was really his only directing credit. Jon Favreau still ran both these shows. A lot of the decisions in these shows were from him. Yes, Grogu coming back was a studio mandated decision, but everything else was from him. But a lot of people were blaming Dave Filoni simply because he worked on the show with Jon Favreau. And this is where doubts started to creep in. Some people definitely didn't like Filoni before because they didn't like how the 2008 Clone Wars show overwrote the 2003 Clone Wars show in terms of canonicity, which is, just a case of nostalgia, people being biased because of nostalgia. But a lot of people started to raise their eyebrows. Then Ahsoka came in 2023. Well, no, Andor came first. Andor came in 2022, and a lot of people thought that Tony Gilroy should be the one writing Star Wars just because Andor was just so good. And then, of course, Ahsoka came out in 2023. And after Ahsoka was more or less disappointing in the eyes of a lot of people, this is what caused a lot of people to turn on Dave Filoni. Because remember, Ahsoka was supposed to be Dave Filoni's big test to see whether or not he could be a good director. He could be a good storyteller in the realm of live-action Star Wars. Because before Ahsoka, he was known as just the cartoon guy. He's the guy who was known for making Star Wars cartoons, and that's where his journey began and ended. And so after Ahsoka came, and a lot of people were disappointed, a lot of people turned on Dave Filoni, and they did not regard him as a good storyteller, not as a person who should be in charge of Star Wars. So the story went from Dave Filoni should save Star Wars to Tony Gilroy should save Star Wars. Or, Dave Filoni should die. He should not be in Star Wars anymore. Let him leave the company, fire him, all that stuff. And after Dave's promotion to become chief creative officer at the company, a lot more people turned against him. The minute Dave got a bit more power at the company, it's as if the fan base just turned against him overnight, despite him, again, not really doing anything wrong other than delivering a less than great product. And so the fan base has kind of turned on Dave Filoni, the same way they turned on Kathleen Kennedy. And a lot of people really don't like the fact that Dave is now in the driver's seat, despite a lot of these people asking for that before. And a lot of people also don't like Dave Filoni's way of storytelling, in that he always protects his characters. He always makes sure they have the most plot armor ever. He's the biggest Ahsoka simp, so on and so forth. Yes, I do have my complaints about Dave Filoni. I do think Dave needs a bit more work. I don't agree with people in saying that he should be the sole president of Lucasfilm, in that he should be running everything, because looking at his past, Dave is not a financials guy in the slightest. He's a storyteller at heart. That's who Dave is. He's a storyteller at heart who needs people to slow him down. And that's why I consider him a lot like George Lucas, in that he's a guy who has all these crazy ideas, but he never has anyone to tell him no. Dave is more or less surrounded by yes men when it comes to his work, and he does need someone to slow him down again, every now and again, which I think was what Kathleen was there for. Kathleen was very much there to slow Filoni down. With her out of the way, he's kind of gonna go unchecked. And whether or not his stories will improve or lessen because of this, we don't know. Time will have to tell. So personally, I never saw Filoni as a financials guy, and people really wanted him to take the sole spot as the sole president of Lucasfilm. Never gelled well with me because that's just not the kind of guy I've seen him as. I also didn't like the last two episodes of Ahsoka. I liked the show mostly for what it was, but I've been on record saying the last two episodes are kind of doo-doo water. And a lot of the stuff he's worked on also aren't great. Clone Wars and Rebels aside, because those are amazing, I don't like Resistance. Resistance to this day is still my least favorite Star Wars project. And I feel like when it comes to Dave Filoni, you shouldn't outright praise the guy, nor should you hate him. You need to have a bit more of a balanced, nuanced view on him. But not for Star Wars fans. Star Wars fans are either you hate him or you love him. And lately, hating him has become the cool new thing because, again, a lot of fans don't like that his products are more or less fan servicey or they're a lot self-indulgent for him, despite other creators also being self-indulgent like James Gunn. But you don't see people complaining because they all love Superman. But that's what I feel like. And so ever since Dave Filoni's announcement, a crazy lie has been spreading throughout the internet that Dave Filoni hates Andor. A lot of people, again, were really unhappy when Dave got announced to be the new president of Lucasfilm, and they decided to take it personally by trying to lie about Dave. They decided that, hey, if Dave is going to be promoted and he's going to be telling our stories, then how about we try to besmirch his name as much as possible? And so within this last week alone, so many lies about Dave Filoni have spread. The most prominent one being, as I mentioned, that he hates Andor. Like I mentioned earlier, ever since the release of Andor back in 2022, a lot of people kind of did a heel turn on Dave Filoni, mostly because they saw Andor as the anti-Dave Filoni product. It didn't rely on cameos, it didn't rely on having pre-established characters tell a story, even though Mon Mothma was one of the main characters, but whatever. And instead of like cool lightsaber fights, it had, long speeches of characters like talking about their place in this world and how they want to stand up to oppression. And so ever since, again, Andor, a lot of people have turned on Dave Filoni, finding his way of telling stories to be cheap and thinking that only one method of Star Wars can exist. This is not me giving my own personal bias, it's just me saying it how I see it. And so a lot of people, just like really, they've been raking on Filoni. This picture, for example, comes from the Andor sub, so it's just one of the things I drew on. But as you can see here, this is a blatant lie. The tweet that's being shown in this image says that Filoni hates Andor. And of course, a lot of fans immediately jump on the boat of calling him a fascist. But as I mentioned before, this simply isn't true and can be debunked by just looking up any clip with Filoni and talking about Andor.
Thing that is taken as different, like Andor it's so well done, and Tony and his team do such a phenomenal job that I think that there's an audience for that. I think also with that audience, I also though want to still be, hitting the imagination of the kids out there so that they can grow up and appreciate those things. You look at
in typical Star Wars fan fashion, they want to deface and just make everyone out who doesn't agree with them or who's not their perfect vision of what they should be to be the worst character ever. They just want to, what's that word? They want to slander every face or figure that doesn't align with theirs. Before Kathleen Kennedy was the big boogie monster. Now that she's out of the way, it's Dave Filoni who's the big boogie monster, and Tony Gilroy is the knight in shining armor who should save us, and so on and so forth. And I just figured I want to get some of those liars out there. This isn't me defending Filoni. This is just me laying down the truth as is. If I want to give my honest thoughts about Filoni, here they are. These are my thoughts on what Filoni is and what I hope from him in Star Wars. For one, I do think that Filoni is a great storyteller and a visionary. This is a man who has a lot of great ideas and a lot of love. This video is going to be so bad. Okay. If you have my honest thoughts on who Dave Filoni is, I think Dave Filoni is a great visionary and a great storyteller. This is a man with clearly a lot of ideas and a huge, huge love for Star Wars. With that said, though, he's also a lot like George Lucas, which I guess is fitting since, again, George Lucas was his mentor. But he's a man who just doesn't know where to stop when it comes to introducing crazy ideas. And he's also a man who just needs someone to give him feedback on his writing. I don't think his writing is bad. Again, a lot of his stuff is great. Clone Wars and Rebels are great, but he does need someone to at least kind of guide him when it comes to bringing his stories to life instead of just them living in his mind and then he puts them down to paper immediately. And as I said, I don't think every one of his products is a hit. I really am not the biggest fan of Resistance, like at all. And I do think Bad Batch, for as good as it is very lackluster when you compare it to the other shows he's worked on in the past. With that said, I don't think that Dave Filoni hates Star Wars. I also don't think he has a certain preference over what he wants in Star Wars when it comes to like the audiences he wants to give. And so having him as president is fine to me because he wants to appeal to everyone. And I guess that should lead to me having my thoughts, giving my thoughts on him as president of Lucasfilm. I want to have hope in Dave Filoni. I want to have hope that Dave Filoni and Lin-Wan Brennan can make Star Wars the great franchise it should be again. And this kind of ties into my final thoughts with Kathleen Kennedy. Now circling back to Kathleen a bit. Kathleen Kennedy, in my opinion, was not the worst president for Star Wars, but I do think that she needed a guiding hand as well. Kathy Kennedy only saw Star Wars as a business, not this big story that needs to be told. Yes, she was all about greenlighting projects that were able to experiment with the brand, but she was not great with planning or structure when it came to these products. And I think that was her biggest downfall. Kathleen Kennedy, much like Disney as a corporation, was very short sighted and only focused on the short term monetary gain. And I do think that was holding Star Wars back a lot. I don't think she put Star Wars in the trenches. A lot of good products came out of Star Wars, but I do think she was holding Star Wars back from where it could truly be because she just couldn't capture that visionary aspect George Lucas had. And for better or for worse, I am kind of glad she's gone because we can enter a new era of Star Wars where we can get new people kind of coming in hands on and caring about, and one person at least cares about the story while the other person cares about the finances and not just primarily caring about the finances. So yes, I don't think Kathleen Kennedy was the best person to run Star Wars. I don't think she was the best fit for it. I do think though she at least tried her best and tried to leave a legacy behind that will be memorable. I don't think a lot of people look at that legacy too fondly. I don't think I'm one of them. She definitely put Star Wars into a bit of a hole with the sequels trilogy, but I can at least respect what she was trying to go for. And I can only hope that Dave Filoni and Lin-Wen can carry the torch for her. As for Dave Filoni, my biggest hope from Dave is I want him to come into Star Wars with a plan. I want him to basically do the DC thing, just make Star Wars. I want Dave Filoni to basically turn Star Wars into the next DC, for lack of a better word. Now that Star Wars is being headed by two people, as is the proper course, like I mentioned with DC, I think that Dave Filoni needs to come out with basically a video that announces what the plan for Star Wars is. We already kind of know what the slate for this year and next year is gonna look like because of Star Wars Celebration, but I don't know if it should be a D23 or next year's Star Wars Celebration. I want Dave Filoni to come out with a huge plan for Star Wars. I want him to say, so and so project is happening, so and so project is not happening anymore, and I want the franchise to look like this going forward. Kathleen Kennedy can still help produce the projects he wants to get out there, but for the meantime, I'm gonna push these projects to come out, and this is what my plan for like the Mandoverse or the Old Republic or the next era post sequels of Star Wars is gonna look like. And yeah, just basically pull a James Gunn, just come out and say what projects are gonna happen, and I want him to be very specific on these projects and for him to be determined to get these projects out. Because Star Wars, as I mentioned, is very infamous for canceling projects. So I want him to be determined in that all these projects, yes, are gonna happen. And even if there may be delays, they are going to hit our screens one way or another. And as for Lin-Wen, I just wanted to be on the finances. I just wanted to tell us, yes, I'm hoping to get as many projects out as possible, but we are going to have to cut some stuff, be it cut the budget or increase so-and-so's project, increase the shows, the amount of seasons for this show, so on and so forth for what it is. That's kind of what I'm hoping for Dave Filoni, and I do want him to be the James Gunn of Star Wars, someone who brings his own energy into the world and lore and is able to make it bigger and better than it ever was. James Gunn has brought his own energy into DC, especially with Superman, and he wants other projects to flourish under other creatives. And I want Dave Filoni to do the same thing as well. I want him to have his projects flourish, which we're going to see both with Maul Shadow Lord later this year and Ahsoka, but I want other projects to succeed as well. Whoever is making Starfighter, I want Starfighter to do well. Is if the Ray movie is still happening, let the Ray movie come out and let it be done well. And if we're gonna get another Tony Gilroy in here to do another Andor type show, let him welcome him in. I do think that his interest in the Star Wars and having Star Wars fans have something they can latch on to, because again, there are different types of Star Wars audiences. I hope him trying to introduce a new project for different Star Wars audiences to latch on to is a goal that can be met, and it's something that, and even if each project is meant for a different type of audience, they all have something in them that fans can be happy with, and they can accept and admire from each other. And guys, I want Dave to do his best, to lock in and do his best as much as the rest of y'all. I really don't want every project to be an Imperial era animated show like Clone Wars and Maul is going to be, or Bad Batch is going to, not Clone Wars, Maul and Bad Batch and Rebels are going to be. We don't need every show to take place in the Imperial era. I don't want all these shows to be about Dave Filoni's OCs doing whatever they want. But so that's why I really do want him to lock in and allow other projects to live and breathe as well. Because there is a time and place for all kinds of Star Wars. But really, it just comes down to structure and timing. And those are two things that Kathleen Kennedy just could not get right. For all her strengths and all her feats as a producer, I think when it comes to actually telling a story, and especially a story as big and grand as Star Wars, Kathleen just couldn't get it right. She was great as a producer, but I think she was very poor as a storyteller and overall as a president of Lucasfilm. I don't hate her as much as other Star Wars fans do, but I am glad she's gone, just so we can see what a new era of Star Wars looks like, especially when it's being run by people who really are actually fans of the franchise. This video went on way longer than I planned it to. It's very messy. You're gonna see a lot of messages pop up in here from my friends and family. I hate that, but it is what it is. That's assuming you even get this far in the video. But if you have, thank you so much for watching, guys. Thank you so very much for listening to me ramble about my opinions on Star Wars. I'm sorry that my videos have not been the best quality they could have been this month so far. I do hope to get back to amazing video making soon. I was kind of on top of my game last year. This year it's just been whatever comes to mind. I want to put it on the screen. But yeah, I just hope I get back onto amazing video making next year. And this style of video won't be repeated again. I promise my videos are going to be a bit more edited, a bit more full of life. I just wanted to try the, for lack of a better word, Thor Skywalker approach to just a topic that was on my mind. And I just wanted to air my thoughts out. Again, it's a topic I have a lot to say on, but also not, I can't word it properly to put into like a short formatted video. But as promised, normal videos will be coming soon, and I will talk about Star Wars and all the great videos that will be coming out soon. There is a short I've made about Daredevil, so I guess that's something different that y'all can watch. It's not really a short. If it was a short, it would be in that format. It's short like, but you'll hopefully enjoy that one. Anyway, guys, that's going to do it from me today. Tell me, what do you think about Kathleen Kennedy leaving Star Wars? Are you hopeful about the future of Star Wars? Are you apathetic, as it seems most people online are? Or are you very dreadful of what Dave Filoni could do next? Leave your thoughts down below. Tell me in the comments. Be sure to like this video if you like. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell to be part of the team. And with that, I've been Captain Phoenix, and I will see you in the universe. Goodbye, my Rangers.